Brennain Lloyd is the Director of Northwatch, a multi-issue environmental, social justice, and peace organization that has existed in northeastern Ontario since the late 80s. The issue of nuclear waste has been a high priority for Brennain for decades. She manages several websites, including nonuclearwaste.ca, nuclearwaste.ca, and stopsmrs.ca. Brennain, you've been working for 3 decades to defend Ontario's communities from the ravages of uranium mining and now more recently nuclear waste disposal. Can you tell us why nuclear waste is such a danger to our communities and what the industry hopes to do with all the deadly radioactive wastes they've generated over the past 70 years?
It's a big story. I'm gonna really do a flyover in 10 minutes around the status, the risk, the challenges with radioactive waste. What the industry would like to do is to solve their public relations problem. What they'd like to do is to be able to say that the problem is solved, and everything, their programs are geared to that end. It's about getting to yes. It's about getting to say that the problem is solved. But we have problems all along the nuclear chain because radioactive waste, nuclear waste, is generated at every step along the along the nuclear chain. Starting with uranium mining, which you mentioned. We haven't had uranium mining in our region for decades, but we have 200 million tons of radioactive acid-generating uranium tailings in what I think can be considered to be temporary management because they require ongoing monitoring, maintenance. They're on surface, they're in dams and dikes, and there's risk. There's constant risk. Uranium tailings are not only, and uranium in general, it's radioactive, so there's issues there, but it's also toxic. So, and in the case of the uranium tailings in the Serpent River Basin, they're also acid generating, so they're leaching other metals out. But we move along the chain, and at every step, now the uranium mining now in Canada is concentrated in the Athabasca Basin in northern Saskatchewan. As we move along the nuclear chain, there's waste generated at every step. So you go from uranium mining to refining, which still happens in our region at the largest uranium refinery in the world in Blind River on the north shore of Lake Huron, and then to fuel production, which happens at Port Hope, Toronto, and Peterborough. And each of those stages generate their own radioactive waste. But what's very frustrating for public interest groups and concerned members of those communities is that it's very difficult to track what wastes are being generated, what are the waste qualities, what are their quantities, and where are they going? Even though each of those facilities are licensed under the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and the associated regulations, and even those licenses require the operators to provide an inventory of their waste, they simply don't. They simply do not. And so it's very difficult to track those wastes, where they're going, and what the hazards are. We move a little along the chain and we come to nuclear power reactors. And then we get into a huge range of different wastes, different radionuclides, different hazards, different systems for at least temporarily managing or containing these wastes. So what the wastes need, here's the challenge. The challenge is to isolate these wastes from the environment into perpetuity. And I would say the industry is failing at every step. So from the reactor, there's low, intermediate, and high level waste. The industry, the nuclear power industry in Canada, and I know I'm most familiar with Ontario, they really have no plan for the long-term isolation or management or containment of any of these wastes, although they will tell you that they have a plan for the high level waste. They did have what they would have called a project. They called a project, I would have called a scheme for the burial of low and intermediate level waste beneath the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station, less than a kilometer from the shore of Lake Huron. And that was an idea that they pursued for over a decade. And in 2020, it was rejected by Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. And OPG is basically bereft of any plans at this point. But there are activities, and some of these activities are of real concern. So one is that large volumes of the low-level waste is incinerated at the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station in what's called the Western Waste Management Facility. And that is to go back to the old adage of the solution to pollution is dilution. These wastes are, the industry will describe that as volume reduction, but in effect, there's some release and there's some dispersion. Really, I think in the very, very long term, that's what these ideas of deep geological repositories are also about. They're not going to contain the waste into perpetuity, but they will slow the movement of those radionuclides to the surface. But I digress. Back to the low-level waste, the other activity that I think is of concern, and which is really very much below the public radar, although we've raised it repeatedly with the regulator to no effect, is that there is a trafficking of low-level radioactive waste. And as Susan mentioned, the private industry are big players in the nuclear sector in Ontario, in Canada. And I believe increasingly, although maybe it's just that we've uncovered in more recent years, the US and international companies are big players. So there's a practice of moving low-level radioactive waste from Canadian generators to the US for what they call processing, which could be incineration, could be compaction, very little information available. And then by US law, they are required to return what's the residual, so sort of the boiled down version of that waste. But what's really, two items of real concern. One is there's no tracking of it. There's no registry. There's no publicly available accounting of what waste is going where and what's coming back. And these are multi-site licenses. So we have looked at a number of licenses that have 9 different generators on the same license. So from 3 chemical facilities, 3 Canadian nuclear laboratory facilities, 3 Ontario power generation facilities, it's all on the same license, and it all goes to the US for processing and then returns. And it can return to any of those 9 facilities. So theoretically, according to these licenses, we could have waste from Pickering being returned to the Blind River uranium refinery. Well, that's not the case because there's no capacity to deal with even their own waste at the Blind River refinery, but the licenses would allow that. So that's just the low. Intermediate, more problematic. High-level waste, more problematic. So high-level waste in Canada is the spent fuel, the irradiated fuel, the reactor fuel waste. High-level waste is what it's called. So these are highly radioactive uranium-filled fuel bundles. They go in their uranium. They come out 18 months later. There are more than 200 different radioactive isotopes, extremely radioactive, and will have to be isolated from the environment into perpetuity, hundreds of thousands of years. At the starting point, they're put into irradiated fuel base, cooling pools at the reactor station. And there are problems with those irradiated fuel bays, which it has taken us considerable time to uncover. And it's only through engaging in license reviews and digging down and digging down and digging down in the documents, you find that there are releases from these irradiated fuel bays into the groundwater. And again, it's very difficult to track the releases. We repeatedly have argued that we should have the groundwater monitoring results, and OPG has refused it. The commission, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, has agreed that it should be publicly available, but yet it is not. So that's in the short term. Then we move to the medium term. It's put into dry storage. These are dry storage containers. The most recent to be constructed at Pickering are going to be constructed immediately at the lake's edge. So the least secure site, the least secure location you could find within that site. And there is there's been no movement in decades on the part of Canadian industry or the Canadian regulator to improve the robustness, the security of the dry storage containers. There's also very limited information available. When we have had participant funding to retain experts to review the dry storage containers to ascertain how effective are they, our experts have told us that there's not enough information available for them to do a technical review. So there's a lot of questions, even at the dry storage stage. But we do know that the fuel is the most vulnerable when it's in the irradiated fuel bay to human error, to loss of cooling from water, loss of input from power, to malevolent acts. It's at its most vulnerable. And yet the waste lingers in the irradiated fuel bays, in the Ontario reactors at least. And we've done just a very easy calculation looking at the amount of time the fuel has been, looking at different volumes each year over a number of, over a 20-year period, and have determined that the majority of the waste, the industry says the waste has to stay in the pool for 8 to 10 years. There is about 2/3 of the waste is still in the pool. About twice as much waste is in the pool as needs to be in the pool. And Angela's giving me the time sign when we're at the issue, which is, looms largest from our perspective, and that is the long-term management of high-level waste, nuclear fuel waste. And there is a plan. Again, I'd call it more a scheme. 1977, 3 men, 3 months, studied the problem of high-level waste and said, let's bury it. And the industry, government, and regulator have followed down that track ever since. In the 1990s, we had a 10-year review of a concept, and that panel review at the end determined that the concept, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited's concept of burying the nuclear waste in the Canadian Shield had not been demonstrated to be safe and acceptable. The federal government said we accept those in principle, and then they turned around and they put the absolute opposite to the panel's recommendations into action, which was they directed the industry to organize themselves into an agency for the long-term management, and that's the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. And for 10 years, 11 years now, they have been conducting a site search for a community they call a willing community, and they say an informed community, although the information available from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is so limited and so all the hard edges have been rounded off. So it's difficult to think that a community could become informed, truly informed, if they were relying on the NWMO's information alone. They're now down to 2 communities, one in northwestern Ontario, Highlevel and the Revel Lake area, between 2 large significant watersheds, and another in southwestern Ontario in a farming community in the heart of the farming community. And they say by 2023, they will make a decision. There's no operating deep geological repository licensed anywhere in the world, despite 40 years of effort on the part of the nuclear industry. And I know I'm out of time, and I hope you'll ask me a question. Thank you.
Yes, we have one question now, and I'm sure there'll be more later, but here's a very specific question. Is the CNSC responsible for collecting the data about radioactive waste products being created at each level of the nuclear fuel chain? Why are they not enforcing this information and making it public? And that's from Brian Beaton.
So they're responsible for ensuring that each licensee includes that information in each license renewal application or in each new application. And I would say in summary, they're not doing it. There are various inventories produced by, a kind of a combination of the players, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, Natural Resources Canada. It's produced, and every 3 years, there's this joint report required under a convention that Canada is a signatory to, but they're incomplete. And particularly they're incomplete when you look at the earlier stages in the fuel chain, and they're incomplete when you look at the later stages, intermediate and high level waste. We don't have consistent, reliable inventories. And you look from one inventory to another, and there are differences and contradictions. And part of this is the problem of not having an independent agency to direct and require that these things are done. And we don't have that. We have a regulator, but we don't have an independent waste management agency or even a review board the way other countries do. And that's a real gap for Canada.
Thank you so much, Brennain, for your decades of commitment to this issue.